Well, so once again, thanks so much for everything that you bring to this kaupapa, the New Zealand Wars. You call it the Great War for New Zealand. Why is that?
Well, the phrase itself comes from a petition of Wiremu Tamihana, the great Ngāti Hoa leader, after the Waikato War, and he said in that petition that after the attack on Rangiaowhia, February 1864, he realised that this would be a very great war for New Zealand. So that's where that line comes from, but I think it also speaks to the fact that this is the defining conflict in New Zealand history, in my view, far more so than World War I and World War II. For so long, Gallipoli was kind of a focus, and for Pākehā, a sort of foundational narrative for the nation, but really the Waikato War, the invasion of Waikato in July 1863, is a decisive moment in New Zealand history. And we live with the consequences of it today in so many ways.
And at the helm, was this character, Governor George Grey. Can you explain the significance and place of Governor Grey?
Well, Grey is a huge figure in 19th century New Zealand history. He served 2 terms as governor, later became a premier as well, prime minister. His first governorship, when he arrived in 1845, the country was at war, the colony was nearly bankrupted. And when he left in 1853, peace had been restored, supposedly the colony was prosperous and thriving and so on again. And he kind of left a hero, really. And so in 1861, when you've got war in Taranaki and a looming confrontation, it seemed, with the Kingitanga and so on, he seemed to be the person who would come back and restore things. But the problem was that things had changed quite dramatically in the intervening period, and Grey didn't really catch up with that. He was a natural autocrat. At a time when Māori were asking for the treaty partnership to be honoured, really, because in 1852, New Zealand had had a new constitution introduced by the British Parliament that established the forerunner to today's Parliament. It met for the first time in Auckland in 1854. There were no Māori members in that Parliament. This is at a time when Māori are the majority of the population in Aotearoa. Most Māori men couldn't vote for that Parliament. So basically you've got a new government established that's entirely hostile to Māori interests. And so Rangatira are asking themselves, where's the partnership that we were promised in 1840? We've been excluded from any decision-making role in the colony. And so they looked around for, what could they do about that? And one of the things that was decided was that if the Crown won't allow us to sit in their Parliament, then we need some kind of mechanism to come together ourselves. So the Kingitanga ultimately comes out of that. It's established in 1858. So when Grey arrives for a second governorship in 1861, things have changed quite dramatically. And the big question is he willing to acknowledge the Kingitanga? Is he willing to share power with Māori? And the answer to that, unfortunately, is no. So he's, from the outset, making preparations for a military confrontation with Waikato, with the heartland of the Kingitanga movement.
Would you believe it was a reaction to, what was happening up in Auckland?
Part of the inspiration for it was Tamihana Turapaha travelled to England. He met with Queen Victoria, and he was very impressed by what he saw. And there were other Māori as well who travelled to Britain. And when Māori are searching for a model, that's one that comes to mind. So Tamihana Turapaha advocates the idea of a kingship. And so it's partly, later on the Kingitanga is accused of being a threat to the Queen's sovereignty, but in fact, those who promote this idea, see it as in some ways a compliment to Queen Victoria, the person of the Queen. They have a problem with the settler government that's established in New Zealand that they're excluded from, but their relationship with Queen Victoria itself is they don't see it as something that's a challenge to that.
What was the relationship between Māori and the Queen?
For many Māori, they saw the Queen as a great rangatira who they had entered into a sacred covenant with. And in fact, when Māori visitors went to England and met with the Queen, she always told them that she loved her Māori people and she would do anything for them. And she was a great rangatira, so her word was her bond, and they expected that the Queen would do that. and that she meant those words, which is why throughout the 19th century there are repeated deputations to Britain to meet with Queen Victoria, to plead with her to intervene on behalf of Māori. King Tāwhia travels there in 1884, takes a deputation, attempts to have an audience with his treaty partner, Queen Victoria. The New Zealand government intervenes to ensure that that doesn't happen at that time, so he leaves without meeting her. But there's this ongoing belief that if only the Queen really knew what was happening to her Māori people, she would intervene to bring justice to them, because after all, a treaty had been signed in her name with Māori, and she was the great Ariki.
Was it naive for them to believe that?
I don't believe it was naive. I think it was engaging with the world from a Māori viewpoint and from a tikanga-based approach. And so, she was seen as a great rangatira, and her word was her bond. And that was the way that rangatira, engaged with one another, the way that they dealt with one another.
Can you explain the mood of the Auckland settlement in the lead up to the Waikato invasion?
The critical factor really is demographics, numbers. So for most of this period after the treaty is signed in 1840, it doesn't really change much on the ground outside settlements like Auckland and Wellington. Māori are still in control of their own affairs, really. And that's something that grates with a lot of settlers, but they're not powerful enough to do anything about that because they're hugely outnumbered for a long time. So by 1858, settler numbers reach parity with Māori for the first time ever. And I think that's really significant because suddenly settlers feel that they are strong enough to confront Māori. And I think it's no coincidence that within 2 years of that, you get the Taranaki War, breaks out in March 1860. And so settlers start to feel that the situation is one that they can now overturn. And, they arrive in New Zealand with a set of ingrained expectations. The Victorian racial hierarchy has them at the apex of that. And they travel here, the other side of the world, and they find that Māori are basically in charge. They dominate the economy, they're independent, they own incredibly valuable lands in the Waikato and elsewhere that many settlers resent the fact that they can't get their hands on. So there is this increasing desire to overturn that state of affairs once Pākehā perceive that they're powerful enough to do so.
It's interesting because when we were talking to Papa Tom yesterday, he was talking to us about this community at Rangiaowhia where hundreds, if not thousands, lived out there in harmony, as he says, with Pākehā New Zealanders, but he said not at the top end of that hierarchy. So were there other New Zealanders or settlers that had arrived that didn't buy into the philosophies of Governor Grey?
Well, Pākehā who settled in the Waikato in the 1840s and 1850s usually married into Māori iwi, and they were expected to abide by their rules and customs, so that in a sense they became assimilated into Māori society. And their kind of outlook in some ways is quite different from many of those whānau. And places like Rangiaowhia and elsewhere through this period are feeding the settlers of Auckland and elsewhere. There's an Auckland newspaper in the 1840s that says that Pākehā there would have starved if it wasn't for Māori bringing produce to the town every week. And so, Pākehā through that early period after 1840 are almost entirely reliant on Māori to feed them, to defend them, to build their roads, and to build their homes and so on. And, later on, they become increasingly resentful of the extent of supposed Māori dominance and look to overturn that.
So back to Auckland, Governor Grey arrives back in town in Auckland. What does he set out to do?
When he arrives in 1861, his predecessor, Governor Gore Brown, had been on the verge of invading Waikato on the basis that many Māori from the Waikato district had intervened in the Taranaki War. And so as he saw it, they were implicated in rebellion themselves. And that invasion was timed to begin in spring of 1861, but Grey arrives and those invasion plans are called off. Had an invasion gone ahead then, it would have been catastrophic for the Crown. They almost certainly would have lost. Grey arrives, he takes one look at the state of military preparations and decides that the Crown is in no position to confront the Kingitanga anytime soon. So One of the very first things he does is order the construction of the Great South Road from Auckland to the Waikato River so that troops can launch an invasion overland. Another thing he does is to ensure that steamers are constructed to be placed on the Waikato River so that you can invade both on water and on land. And he also massively increases the number of British troops in New Zealand. And through most of this period, the Colonial Office are sending orders to him to send the troops back to wherever they've come from because he's accumulated so many of them. But he keeps them until he's confident that he's ready to launch an invasion of Waikato in July 1863.
So for years, here are these examples of his intention to invade, despite what's recorded in history as the reason why they had to invade.
Well, it's a moot question as to whether the moment he arrived in 1861 he had determined on an invasion from the outset, but he certainly made preparations for that eventuality. I mean, Grey himself said that he had hoped to be able to restore peaceful relations with the Kingitanga, but the way that he acted over the next 18 months to 2 years didn't really indicate that. He seemed to go out of his way to antagonise the Kingitanga, who would come and visit him and say that they were worried about things like steamers being potentially placed on their river and the build-up of troops and so on. And Grey would kind of taunt them. One of his final meetings with Kingitanga leaders in January 1863, he was reported to have said that he would dig around the Maori king until he fell of his own accord. And for many Kingitanga supporters, that was final confirmation that Grey would not allow the Maori king to survive. It's pretty clear by then that there is going to be an invasion, there will be a confrontation.
Can you describe the logistics of supply lines? And you talk about him holding on to all these troops. What kind of numbers are you talking about?
In total, there were about 18,000 troops on the Crown side involved in the invasion of Waikato. Mostly consisting of British Imperial regiments, but also colonial troops and a few Maori allies, although they played a very limited role, mostly ferrying goods. So you've got a professional standing army belonging to the world's great superpower, which Britain was in the 1860s, unquestionably the world's leading superpower, up against a civilian population that doesn't have a standing army, it doesn't have a supply line. So Kingitanga fighters not only have to defend themselves, but they also have to feed themselves. The British have a supply train. They have dedicated people to supply them with food and everything else that they require. The British also have the latest weaponry, Enfield rifles and others, and heavy artillery, which is what the Kingitanga lacks as well. So this is very much asymmetrical warfare. On paper, it should have been no competition. And in some ways, it's a miracle that Māori survived it all, that the Kingitanga survived this war, because Grey didn't go to war to teach the Kingitanga a lesson. He went to war to destroy it, and he failed in that objective at the end of the day.
You say there's 18,000, in the army or the standing army. What would the population of New Zealand, just give us an idea of what that meant in terms of the wider population?
So in 1858, the Pākehā population of New Zealand was just under 60,000. So these are huge numbers, and really New Zealand is under military occupation through this period. If you lived in a town like Auckland, you couldn't have escaped the fact that it was under military occupation, and a lot of Pākehā did quite well out of that. Shop traders loved it because they were supplying the British Army. Most adult men, Pākehā men in Auckland between the ages of 16 and 55 were subject to conscription, and so they could be called up into service as well. And some couldn't wait. They couldn't wait to do that. Others, they tried to get out of it. And eventually a scheme was introduced that allowed rich men to buy their way out of the army. They just needed to find a substitute for them. So, there's kind of growing awareness that there's this confrontation ahead. And some people are hugely excited by that, and others are more apprehensive about it.
Yeah, can you describe some of those units, those groupings?
You have the militia, who are basically the conscripts, and often what they're doing is guarding the approaches to Auckland. Then you've got volunteer units. You've got the Forest Rangers, which is an elite unit that's established to fight irregular warfare, and they're basically there to pursue bush warfare, because the British Army is not really designed to fight that kind of war. So the whole idea is that this is a more fleet-footed response to the way that Māori engage in the war in the early phases, which is essentially based on slowing the British advance south down the Great South Road through ambushes, through bush warfare and so on. So you've got these units that are established colonial units to fight alongside the British Army.
There needed to be a reason for war. The proclamation is spoken about quite a bit. What's your understanding of the proclamation, and was it used to justify the war?
Yeah, so there are two proclamations in the immediate lead up to the invasion of Waikato. The first is on the 9th of July 1863, and that basically says to all Māori living between Auckland and Waikato that they should swear an oath of allegiance to Queen Victoria or immediately leave. And many of the communities who had received that oath living around the South Auckland area had first settled there in order to protect the settlers of Auckland. And now they've been told to pack up their belongings and go. And many of them assume that if they sign the Oath of Allegiance, they would be required to fight for the Crown against their own kin. And that's something that they couldn't bring themselves to do. So very, very few people sign that Oath of Allegiance. Mostly they pack up whatever belongings they can carry with them, and they trek south to beyond the Waikato River to join their kin to wait for the inevitable invasion. So those communities at Mangere, at Ihumata, Pukaki and elsewhere are basically driven from their lands at gunpoint, and they leave behind their cattle, their homes, their flour mills, their waka, all of that stuff. And a lot of it is looted by settlers in Auckland who round up cattle and take them into Auckland and auction them off and so on. So there's that proclamation on the 9th of July. 2 days later, on the 11th of July, there's a second proclamation which says that the Crown is about to move into Waikato, that Māori there should comply with instructions, that those who offer resistance will forfeit any rights that they have under the Treaty of Waitangi. Now that's dated the 11th of July, but a Crown official at the time, John Gorse, wrote that it hadn't been delivered until the 14th or 15th of July. I've seen a draft of the proclamation that's dated the 13th of July, and the reason that that's significant and important is because Waikato itself was invaded on the 12th of July. So the ultimatum whereby they might have saved their lives and their lands had they complied with its terms is still being penned after Waikato is invaded. So in other words, it's not really intended to give them an opportunity to comply, it's just window dressing to make it appear as if this is a just war. Grey is concerned about his reputation, and it's a very grave step to be attacking your own people, subjects of the Crown, which is what he's doing, launching a war against thousands of people. And so he wants to make it appear as if he's been left with no alternative. He's partly looking towards British public opinion, where ironically he has this reputation as a great humanitarian, and he's attempting to preserve that, even as he launches, this huge invasion of the Waikato.
So when they did cross the Mangatawhiri River and signalled that war had started, given Waikato Māori may not have been prepared, what was that, the first skirmish or battle like?
So the first engagements take place 5 days later at Kohiroa, not far from there, and a second engagement on the same day at a place called Martin's Farm in the Ramarama district, where a party of British troops are marching up the Great South Road are ambushed. And that kind of sets the tone for the following few months, where the British make very, very slow progress south, and their supply lines and troops marching down the Great South Road are subject to frequent attacks from the bush, which is why the forest rangers are set up in an attempt to counter that. So it's not really until later in the year, until November, that the British start to make significant progress south.
Can you describe, what did Governor Grey look like? What was his character like?
By that stage he would have been in his early 50s, I think. So still a relatively young man. He had recently separated from his wife, and he was an opium addict as well. So he was, at the time of the invasion of Waikato, he was undergoing a few personal challenges of his own, and some observers wondered whether that was influencing his decision making in some ways.
Was he a scholar, or was he a military man? What kind of individual was he?
Well, he was an amateur ethnographer. He was very interested in Maori culture in Waikato, and he collected books. When he established his mansion on Kauai Island, he imported a whole lot of exotic flora and fauna as well. And so he was, by the standards of the day, quite a cultured man, and seen as this progressive, civilised, even humane figure who had this reputation as a great humanitarian. And part of it based on his first governorship of New Zealand as well in the 1840s.
So what changed?
Well, Grey, by the time he arrives in New Zealand for a second governorship, has recently separated from his wife. He's basically an opium addict, and he finds that the old tricks that he employed in the 1840s, what his critics called the flour and sugar policy, no longer works, and he can't get away with flattery and that kind of thing anymore. And the context has changed dramatically. In the 1840s, he didn't have a Mighty King movement that he was required to deal with. And Grey was a not natural autocrat, so he wasn't prepared to engage with the Kingitanga in a way that treated them as treaty partners. He saw it as a threat. And a lot of people wondered whether his personal challenges, the circumstances of his own life was starting to influence or cloud his judgment and his decision making at this time.
Were there rules to war?
There were widely understood codes of conduct that you didn't kill prisoners, you didn't attack civilians, attacking women and children and so on. So there were codes of conduct. I think the very first Geneva Convention was signed in 1864, not long after the Waikato War. But these ideas about appropriate military conduct were widely understood at this time.
That must have made it very difficult for a standing army to go to war with civilians then.
Absolutely. I mean, the context is really critical here, because in a way, when you're attacking a population like this that doesn't have a standing army, it's very difficult to not to kill a lot of people who were not, offering any resistance whatsoever. And you see that time and again with the attack on Rangiaowhia, for example, and with the killing of women and children at Arako and elsewhere. So throughout the war, there are many non-combatants who are killed in the conflict. And
for Governor Grey, he would also have to be in line with the thinking of people like Duncan Cameron. Was he? Did they both believe in the same objective?
Grey and Cameron's relationship became an increasingly strained one. Cameron arrives in the country in 1861 to take command of British troops in New Zealand, and originally he's quite gung-ho and kind of looking forward to a confrontation. But he becomes really increasingly disillusioned with the war and with what his troops have been asked to do. And I think, like a lot of the ordinary men themselves, are asking themselves, why should we be fighting and dying in this war for the benefit of settlers in New Zealand? So they come to see it as a land grab, basically, that they benefit from in no way whatsoever. And they wondered why the settlers in New Zealand shouldn't be doing their own dirty work for themselves. And the interesting factor here is that up to 2/3 of the rank and file soldiers in the British Army who served in New Zealand were Irish. And Ireland is the original blueprint for British imperialism. It's the guinea pig for that. It's where they tried out all these policies of invasion and confiscation and so on. And so for a lot of those men, I think, could increasingly see the parallels with the history of their own country. I mean, they've been asked to do to Māori what had been done to their own people.
Did they fall away? What would have happened? Is there accounts of letters being written or people trying to leave?
Well, there's one of the challenges is that a lot of those men were illiterate, so they weren't leaving behind letters and diaries recounting their experiences. But there's enough anecdotal evidence to suggest that they did become increasingly disillusioned with the war. And this is at a time when people in Britain are also, British taxpayers are saying, why should we be funding this war on the other side of the globe for the exclusive benefit of settlers in New Zealand? Why shouldn't they be funding that war and fighting it themselves? So there are increasingly questions being asked about this. There are humanitarian movements in Britain who are campaigning against the war, against land confiscations, as news of those policies circulate back to Britain as well. So there is growing resistance towards this, and eventually the decision is made by 1866 to withdraw all British troops from New Zealand. And so after that, the later phase of the New Zealand War was fought exclusively by colonial troops and the Maori allies on the Crown side.
Just getting into a little bit of those battles at Rangiriri there, when we talk to Rahui and Brad, they talk about how unlike the Taranaki wars, they hadn't seen some of this new equipment like the steamers and things like that. And so they had prepared for on land but kind of not on the water. Tell us about some of the challenges of Rangiriri, the PA site there, the land side of it, and then the challenges for Maori to defend the water.
Well, one of the issues is that they're outnumbered. There are about 500 defenders. They're up against, I think, around 1,400 on the Crown side. And again, in terms of the equipment that's available to both sides, this is, the British have armour-plated steamers there with 40-pounder Armstrong guns that have a firing range of over 2 kilometres. I mean, Kingitanga has nothing like that whatsoever. So not only are they outnumbered, but in terms of the military technology that is available, this is asymmetrical warfare, and it's a huge challenge. Maori are outnumbered in terms of technology. It's hugely one-sided.
One of the difficulties for the soldiers, though, is that they couldn't actually get into the PA. Tell us about the latter situation.
So the trenches at Rangiriri are 4 metres deep, and when the British attempt to scale those on the 20th of November 1863, they find that their ladders aren't long enough. They're easy prey for Maori at the top of the parapets just to fire down on them as they attempt to make their way up. And Rangiriri is, an impressive fortification. It's not a conventional PA. It's like it's nearly 1 kilometre long trench that runs from the Waikato River across to Lake Waikato, and the British make repeated attempts to storm that, and they suffer heavy casualties. And eventually, the following morning, they take the PA, really probably in an act of subterfuge. When Māori inside the PA raise a white flag, the British enter the PA, they take everybody prisoner. A white flag is not necessarily indicative of surrender. It's often used in war to indicate a desire for a temporary truce, for example, while both sides buried their dead, or while they talked potential terms and so on. And it was clear that this was the indication then, but once the British had entered the PA, it was really too late. What's less clear is whether that was raised in response to a British white flag, because there are stories that was the case. The other thing that we know is that those inside the PA at Rangiriri afterwards said that they hadn't raised the flag to surrender. They wanted to talk terms, they wanted a temporary truce. But after Cameron's men had entered the PA, it was kind of too late. They were taken prisoner. So it was seen as a treacherous act, as an act of subterfuge, the way that the British had taken that PA. For Cameron, that they had made repeated attempts to storm the PA and failed, and they'd suffered heavy losses. So the way that Rangiriri is taken, I think later has consequences during later engagements when Māori are reluctant to surrender for fear that they would also be taken prisoner. And at that stage, it was very unclear what the fate of those 180 Rangiriri prisoners would be. Would they be hanged for rebellion? That was entirely possible. So this does have consequences further on in the war as well.
If you were to believe the soldiers, the army side, that they had won and the flag was raised in defeat, their rules of engagement would be that they would round up the prisoners, but women and children, it's recorded that they have been killed as they were fleeing. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, so, and also, there's this question about the British claim that Rangiriri had been surrounded, but in fact, during the evening, Wiremu Tamihana and many others left the pā. There were some reports that Tāwhia was there as well. I think that's unlikely, but there were large numbers of people evacuating the pā, so it was clear that it wasn't surrounded. And the way that it's taken is seen as an act of great treachery.
Rangiriri was a turning point in their campaign. Why do you think they underestimated it so badly?
Well, Cameron had made reconnaissance missions to inspect it from the river and was unimpressed by what he saw, really. So part of the brilliance of the design was that it looked underwhelming from a distance, and the British didn't really realise that the skill and the intricacy that had gone into the design of that pā.
Tell me about the design of Rangiriri.
Well, it's not a conventional sort of rectangular type pā. It's a long trench that's nearly 1 kilometre long that runs from the Waikato River across to Lake Waikato. So it was a hugely impressive feat of Maori military engineering. One thing we know from earlier wars was that British officers and commanders consistently underestimated Maori military expertise and the design of their pās, and we see this again in the Waikato War as well.
Maori we've spoken to about the defensive campaign was about enticing or forming a bottleneck to the next one, or setting up dummy pās. When do you think that they realised that this was the case?
I think for Cameron, he kind of realises after the Rangiriri battle just how impressive these fortifications were, and so by February 1864 the troops have marched up the Waipā River and they come to Patarangi, and that's an even more formidable chain of fortifications, probably the most impressive ever seen in this country. And Cameron, camped there for weeks trying to decide what should he do and how would he take Patarangi, and his eventual solution was not to even attempt to do so, but to bypass it.
To where?
Cameron's goal is places like Rangiaowhia, Te Awamutu, Kihikihi and so on that are being protected by the chain of defensive fortifications at Patarangi.
What was the significance of being able to conquer the Waikato River with the boats and stuff?
Well, the Waikato River was State Highway 1 really at this time. Whoever controlled the river controlled access to the Waikato, and Grey really, the invasion begins in July 1863. By the end of that month, the first of the armour-plated steamers have arrived, and they're crucial in terms of being able to transport troops and also supplies right into the heart of the Waikato district. So control of that river is crucial.
What happened on the Waikato River pre the war, and who had access to it post the war?
Well, prior to the Waikato War, the river was often used to ferry goods to market in Auckland, to feed the settlers of Auckland. And there were portages that would be used at Waiku to gain entry to the Manukau Harbour, and then at Otahuhu to gain entry to the Waitemata Harbour. And so this was the main way in which people and goods moved. And prior to the Great South Road, there's really no reliable overland route. So control of the river itself is crucial in terms of the overall outcome of the Waikato War.
And they knew that?
Absolutely. So, not just in terms of ferrying goods up and down the river, but also in terms of the way that it enabled the British to bring in heavy artillery and to fire from the river into pā.
And so the Maori would have known that early on, because they were trying to tell Governor Grey that they didn't want those steamboats on their river. Was that the beginning of it?
Yeah, there are repeated attempts to plead with Grey not to bring steamers onto the Waikato River, because there is that awareness. There's also, I think, an understanding about the significance of road building, that roads could be useful to take supplies to market. They could also be used for troops to march down and invade their district as well. So there is that anxiety around road building and steamers and so on, but Grey does nothing at all to allay those concerns at all.
They bypassed Pāterangi and to Rangiaowhia. What's your understanding of what happened there and why?
So late on the evening of the 20th of March 1864, Cameron orders his troops to march in single file silently around the Pāterangi defences. So they sneak around it in the middle of the night with the aid of some Maori guides. By early the following morning, they reach Te Awamutu, St John's Church here, and there are very few people at Te Awamutu. Cameron issues orders to immediately push on to Rangiaowhia, a few kilometres up the road. And so the invading force arrives at Rangiaowhia about dawn on a Sunday morning. And the thing about Rangiaowhia is it's not a pa, it's just an open village. It has no defences, no organised defences of its own. And it's a place of sanctuary for women, children and old men. Because after the battle at Rangiriri in November 1863, the Kingitanga had been criticised for the presence of women and children in the pa. And Grey had written to Kingitanga leaders and said, send them elsewhere, send them to a place of safety.
And they did.
And they did. And 9 days before the attack on Rangiaowhia, a message was passed via Bishop George Selwyn, who was acting as a chaplain to the British Army, that Rangiaowhia had been nominated as the place of sanctuary for the non-combatants. And so there was an expectation that that would be complied with. And instead, the people in the village find themselves under attack. So there's panic, there's terror. What
kind of numbers were at Rangiaowhia? And, it was not just Maori there either, were there?
There'd been, prior to the war, there had been some settler families that had intermarried with local Maori there as well. By the time of the attack in February 1864, the population had swelled because there were women and children and other non-combatants who had gone there as a designated place of safety. So the population was relatively significant. And before the war, Rangiaowhia was the granary of New Zealand in some ways. It was renowned for the wheat that was grown there and all kinds of produce. Rangiaowhia is at the heart of this thriving Māori economy that is feeding the settlers of Auckland and elsewhere.
Yeah, what's your understanding of what happened at Rangiaowhia?
So the Crown forces arrive before dawn on the Sunday the 21st of February, and there's panic and terror amongst the people there who sort of run for their lives. There's an attack on a group of Māori sheltered in a whare. There are some British troops who are shot, and that appears to anger their comrades in arms, and eventually the decision is made to deliberately set alight that whare. One old man attempts to come out and surrender with his arms in the air, and he's shot. And after that, the other people in the whare don't come out, so they're torched to death. One of the things about the attack on Rangiaowhia was that because this wasn't a fighting pa, that there were mostly women and children and old men there was kind of every incentive in the official reports to downplay what took place. And I think, we can't rely on the written record necessarily to remember everything that took place there. What we do know is that what did take place at Rangiaowhia became a source of enormous mamae over the years when it was remembered, and Wiremu Tamihana was angered by it, and missionaries talked about 10 or 20 years later they'll encounter Māori who, when they talked about Rangiaowhia, became hugely angry about it because it was seen the people who were killed at Rangiaowhia weren't considered the victims of war, they were considered the victims of murder, kohuru.
Who was there? Who were the perpetrators?
So there were a range of colonial units at Rangiaowhia, the Colonial Defence Force. Marmaduke Nixon, who was of the Colonial Defence Force on cavalry, they kind of led the charge into the village. They were followed closely by the Forest Rangers, Wontempski and others were there. And then there are the British Imperial regiments as well. So there are a range of forces that attack that settlement. And there are skirmishes and incidents that kind of break out all over the village because this is not a focused pa. You don't have that single source of what's happening. But so you have people sheltering in the church, you have the whare being set alight, you have other people running for their lives. And so it's a chaotic scene, but a scene full of terror, really.
We're here in Te Awamatu in this church which was built in the 1850s pre the war, and it has a sister church out there at Rangiaowhia that still stands today. There is confusion or more than one story around the church's position at Rangiaowhia. What do you know of that?
Well, my understanding is that the whare that was deliberately torched was a whare karakia, which could mean a church in the Pākehā version, like St John's or St Paul's Church at Rangiaowhia, or it could mean a place of worship, not necessarily Christian. And there, so those are some of the stories that I've heard. But one of the things about the attack on Rangiaowhia is because it wasn't a fighting pa, but just an open village full of non-combatants, there wasn't really an incentive for the British and colonial forces in there when they were writing up accounts of what took place to go into too many details around that. So I think there are still aspects of this that are not necessarily that well documented. One of the things is that the official death toll was 12 Māori killed. Other accounts say over 100. There's no way of establishing definitively what the actual number was. What we do know is that what took place at Rangiaowhia was a source of enormous pain for many Māori afterwards.
What about Bishop Selwyn? Māori trusted him. They had turned to the faith of the church. They were God-fearing people out there at Rangiaowhia, yet Bishop Selwyn had become the bishop also for the army. How would that have been perceived by those people who had faith in the church?
Well, Bishop Selwyn's role as army chaplain was kind of seen as a betrayal of his Māori flock, and Selwyn had a reputation as a great humanitarian, a friend of Māori, and so the fact that he was seen to be so closely aligned to the invading force was something that was seen as a kind of betrayal.
Were there other missionaries out there?
At Rangiaowhia itself, there were two churches. There was an Anglican church and a Catholic church that were kind of at either ends of the settlement. And one of the interesting stories from the invasion there is that in the 1840s, Māori from that settlement ground a bag of flour in their own flour mill, and they sent it to Queen Victoria as a present, which elicited complaints from the British government because you're not supposed to send presents to the Queen without asking permission. But anyway, they receive in return 2 lithographs of the British royal family, and when they arrive in Aotearoa, Māori flock to view these images of the royal family, these taonga that are brought to them. They're taken back to Rangiaowhia and they're divided up between the Anglicans and the Catholics. They each get one. And the Catholic one is destroyed, possibly during the invasion in 1864, that's slightly unclear. The Anglican one is, depending on your perspective, either looted or put aside for safekeeping during that attack. It later turns up and is now in Te Awamutu Museum.
How should Rangiaowhia be remembered in New Zealand history?
Well, Rangiaowhia, the events there were terrible and tragic ones, and atrocities were committed there. People were deliberately tortured to death inside a whare. That's clear. I know that there were some accounts by members of the Crown Forces who said that whare was set alight accidentally. Which, if you think about it, if you didn't see it being deliberately set alight, you might assume that it was an accident. That's a natural assumption to make, an understandable assumption to make. On the other hand, there are multiple accounts by members of the Crown Forces who said that they deliberately set it alight. There's no reason whatsoever why you would fabricate a story that we deliberately torched it. Even General Cameron said that the whare was fired. So, actively fired rather than an accident. So, in my mind, there's no doubt whatsoever around that whare was deliberately set alight.
What's the New Zealand government's understanding or acknowledgement of what happened there today?
I don't know if there's an official government view on that, but it's something I know that Ngāti Apakura are talking about, a process of reconciliation and healing that needs to happen at Rangiaowhia. And also, I think re-establishing a presence in that settlement, because, this was a place that was a thriving, prosperous, industrious settlement before the Waikato War, and after it, like the rest of Waikato, those lands are confiscated and handed over to Pākehā settlers, and Maori are kind of driven from that settlement.
The New Zealand government is very vague about the details of Rangiaowhia, even today when we ask. And when you go out there, it's a very small commemoration for such a massacre. Is that good enough?
Yeah, well, the monument that's out there was erected by the Kingitanga in 2014, the 150th anniversary. And I think there do need to be more effort made to making resources available for people to understand that history, to engage with that history so that they know what took place there.
When you consider that there's a statue of Marmaduke Nixon in Otahuhu, but the Crown, the government, hasn't bothered to have anything at all at Rangiaowhia, it doesn't seem right.
No, that's right. And I think the other thing as well is that as part of this process of reconciliation and healing, looking to restore confiscated lands to Ngāti Apakura in their place so that they can have a permanent presence there again today.
Yeah, I mean, you've been on this journey for a long time, so you've visited these places and spoken to plenty of people around the Waikato. What do you think the mood is for reconciliation and acknowledgement?
I think once people become aware of the history, that there is that willingness to engage with it, but it's sharing the stories is the hard part, because so many New Zealanders learnt nothing about this at school. And so it's just actually informing people about what took place. And a lot of Pākehā in the Waikato district probably drive by these sites every day and they're not even aware that they're there, or the terrible events that took place at Rangiaowhia, Rako and elsewhere. So it's just getting those stories across, making that information available and having conversations around that history and why, as a nation we need to take ownership of it. I think it's really important to be upfront and honest with ourselves around the fact that some terrible, terrible things happen in these places.
We're in 2020 now, but even if we consider the time in 1863, can there be any justification for the war on the Waikato?
None whatsoever. The invasion of Waikato was a predetermined war of conquest and invasion on the Crown's part. That's absolutely clear. Governor Grey attempted to justify the unjustifiable, really, through assembling a dodgy dossier of evidence that supposedly incriminated Tainui, but in fact did no such thing. I mean, for example, Rewi Maniapoto, the great Ngati Maniapoto rangatira, was supposedly intent on attacking the settlement of Auckland and massacring its residents, and this was one of the justifications cited for invading the Waikato as a preemptive move. In fact, he was returning from a tangi in Taupo when the invasion began and rushed back north to defend his community from this invasion that was unfolding. So when you scrutinise these claims by Grey, they fall away completely.
When you consider the Treaty of Waitangi, did Governor Grey just misinterpret it, or was it purposely misinterpreted?
I think Grey, like many other Pākehā in the 19th century, saw the treaty as a treaty of cession. Māori had ceded sovereignty to the Crown, and that was an end of story. They didn't view it as something that had guaranteed Māori a place in the governance of Aotearoa, an equal footing with Pākehā in that. And for Grey, he saw Māori independence as a threat to British sovereignty, to the Queen's sovereignty, as something that had to be eliminated. So in 1863, it's not the Kingitanga, it's not Tainui attempting to overthrow the status quo, it's actually the Crown. They're the ones that are attempting to overthrow the state of affairs that have been in place since 1840, where Tainui, like most other iwi, were managing their own affairs as they always had, as had been promised them in the treaty.
And in your opinion, what was the impact of that for Waikato? Actually, what was the impact of the war for New Zealand?
The Waikato War was devastating for Tainui, and not just in the short term. I think we still live with the consequences of it today in so many ways. I think you can see it in the socioeconomic statistics for Māori communities throughout the Waikato region. In 1900, the government published an official return of Māori rendered landless as a result of confiscation. And there are over 3,000 names on that list. And behind each name would be a whānau story of dispossession, of exile, of poverty. And the consequences of that resonate over generations, really. And for the Crown, they'd kind of embarked on the war partly as a speculative venture, because it was assumed that they would make a thumping profit. In the short term, that didn't happen at all. Over 1.2 million acres of land is confiscated. Part of that is allocated to military settlers in return for 3 years military service, so a private would receive 50 acres, a senior officer would receive 400 acres. A lot of those men had no farming experience, they had no capital, they were living in the middle of an active war zone, and many of them sold their lands off to Auckland speculators, men like Frederick Whittaker and Thomas Russell, who were actually architects of the confiscation policy in 1863 as government ministers. And they sat on their investments for a while and eventually, sold off many of those lands and made a huge profit. Towns were established on those lands, a hugely prosperous dairy industry that Māori are basically shut out from. And so there's the loss of lands, but also there's the destruction almost overnight of that thriving Tainui economy that up until 1863 had been feeding the settlers of Auckland. That's devastated, that's just eliminated. And the survivors of the war retreat south of the Tainui River into the King Country district. The population there doubles almost overnight, and there's huge deprivation. There are reports of people dying of starvation in the mid-1860s. So that has massive ramifications. But I think also in terms of, if we examine what was this war about, why did Grey go to war? To impose the Crown's understanding of the treaty relationship as one where the Crown was in charge. The Crown doesn't achieve total victory, but it achieves enough to impose its dominance on Māori, and that has almost immediate consequences. So the Waikato War ends in 1864. Within a year of that, you've got the Native Land Court established, which has been described as an engine of destruction for Māori society. 2 years after that, you get the native school system established. So one strips Māori of their land and the other of their language, and those wouldn't have been possible without the Waikato War, and we live with the consequences of that today still.
What became of the Kingitanga?
Against all odds, the Kingitanga survived the invasion of Waikato, and that wasn't part of the Crown's blueprint. Some Tainui people have said to me that they see this as a story of survival, of endurance. We're still here, despite everything that was thrown at them, which is extraordinary when you think about the fact that Tainui were pitted against the world's leading military superpower in the 1860s.
You talk about deprivation and poverty. What about those who were injured? Are there stories about the war, the people who defended their pa came off second best?
Yeah, so the survivors who made their way south to the King Country, they didn't easily have access to medicine or assistance, and they lived in extreme deprivation, but for some considerable time. And you know, the population of the King Country doubled almost overnight, and there were outbreaks of typhoid and other diseases caused by overcrowded and unsanitary living conditions because of that. And so there were a range of consequences that came out of this as well.
Kingi Tawhiao went into Te Nehe Nui, which then became the King Country. When did the Kingitanga return to Waikato?
So in the early 1880s, King Tawhia laid down his firearms and didn't surrender, but you know, brought a long period of uneasy peace to an end. And in 1884, Tawhia leads a deputation to England, to Queen Victoria, to seek the return of the confiscated lands. And there's this long, drawn-out process whereby the Crown offers the Kingitanga a tiny fraction of the lands that have been confiscated from them, and it's consistently refused. And the New Zealand government intervenes to ensure that Tawhia doesn't get to meet with Queen Victoria, who he's sure would intervene on their behalf if only she knew what had happened to her Maori people.
How long did it take for the return of those lands or the raupatu to be sorted?
So in 1995, the Waikato Raupatu Settlement Act is passed, and so 1.2 million acres of lands were confiscated. The settlement itself is worth $170 million, which sounded like a huge sum of money, but at the time of the settlement itself, the unimproved value of those confiscated lands was $12 billion. So the settlement was 1.4% of that. So Tainui signed away over 98% of the unimproved value of everything that they lost in the raupatu when they signed that settlement. And that's typical for treaty settlements, but something that most Pākehā don't realise.
We, as New Zealanders, remember war well in this country, perhaps not the Waikato War, but other wars, and much is made of Victoria Crosses when they're given. Tell us about the first one here in the Waikato Wars.
So Charles Heafy was involved as a colonial troop in engagement that took place at Wadi in February 1864, when a group of British soldiers who were bathing in the river, Mangapiko River, attacked by a Māori group, and Heafy rescues one of the wounded soldiers, and he later lobbies quite energetically and ultimately successfully to be awarded a Victoria Cross, which is a huge deal because prior to that time no colonial soldier anywhere in the British Empire had ever been awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest honour for military gallantry that could be awarded in the British Empire, but Heafy eventually does achieve that.
When you consider awards like that, it makes a bit of a mockery of our war history and the awards that we've given out. How could Maori warriors and leaders like Wiremu Tamihana and Rewi Maniapoto, how could they be remembered fairly?
Well, I think we should remember Wiremu Tamihana and Rewi Maniapoto as remarkable men, and there are lots of things that we could learn from them. They've often been compared as sort of Wiremu Tamihana, the leader of the so-called moderate faction of the Kingitanga, and Rewi Maniapoto, the extremist. But I don't think that's fair at all on either of them. I think it's better to view Rewi Maniapoto as a realist, because he thought that if Tainui didn't abandon the Kingitanga, it was a question of when and not if they would be attacked by the Crown. And he didn't want war, but he was prepared to fight in defence of the Kingitanga if that's what it came to. Wiremu Tamihana had a different role as a rangatira. His role was as a peacemaker rather than a warrior, and throughout his life he strove for peace, and he strove to bring Māori and Pākehā together, and he was really heartbroken by the Waikato War, and died prematurely a few years later, and spent the last few years of his life petitioning for an inquiry into what had unfolded. He sought justice. He sought the return of the confiscated lands, and he was bewildered at being accused of being a man of war when he was a man of peace. And so there's a great tragedy in his story as well, but there's also lots that people can learn from Mōremi Tamihana, who's an inspirational figure.
I just wanted to touch on, Waikato and Maniapoto were labelled rebels in it. What are your thoughts around that, and reconciliation around that word at least? What did that mean?
Well, it was a crown in 1863 that was attempting to subvert the status quo and attempting to overthrow the situation where the Tainui tribes were just, managing their own affairs as they always had, and as had been promised them in the treaty. So, that wasn't rebellion at all. In a way, it was the Crown that was disavowing its relationship with them and saying that they had had enough of Māori autonomy, that they felt strong enough and confident enough by this point to overthrow that state of affairs.